Hello, everyone. This video is designed to define systemic racism using a comparative example from public health. In using a public health example, my goal is to make it clear that there is a distinct role for public sector personnel across a wide array of disciplines in advancing social equity in the public sector. As I explain the role of systemic racism in structuring opportunities for different groups, I will use Black Americans as a socially constructed racial grouping, but also to collectively refer to Black people across the African diaspora as an ethnic grouping. So before I begin, I want to be clear about what systemic racism is not. Systemic racism is not about a racist or a group of racists working within an organization to intentionally harm or work against Black people or any other group of people. Systemic racism is not an individual or a single policy that's intended to somehow harm or target Black people or any other group of people. And lastly, systemic racism is not contingent upon policymakers or others in positions of power or authority agreeing that it exists. So, what is systemic racism? Systemic racism is a set of interconnected policies that combine to create differential outcomes. In doing so, some groups of people are unfairly advantaged, while other groups are unfairly disadvantaged. The reason we call it systemic is because these policies and practices are embedded in many different systems, organizations, institutions, and agencies, and at various different levels. This includes public organizations, private, government, nonprofit organizations. So, as we know, in public administration, we talk about systems. And just as a refresher, systems are refer to a complex set of intertwined or interconnected entities, and all of the affiliates are subcomponents. The public sector consists of many different systems as well as the society as a whole. A few examples of these systems and subsystems in the United States include healthcare, criminal justice, education, public safety, finance, transportation, the military, and so on. So all of these are systems. These systems are complex and dynamic, which means that they are frequently changing. There are numerous inputs, which are the resources that go into these systems. That also includes personnel. There are processes, what these systems do and the people within them, what they do and how they do it. It's the outputs, what products are produced or generated, and then the feedback loops. And this is how they respond to calls for change or improvement, and the environment in which the system operates and continuously interacts with. Most systems, most public systems, that is, are what we refer to as open systems, in that they continuously act and interact with other systems in the public. These relationships mean that the system is influenced by these subsystems, and these subsystems are influenced by the system. Um, from my anatomy and physiology days, I like to think about, make the comparison with cells. And some cells we know are what we call permeable, and then some are semi-permeable. And that has to do with the ability to allow water or other substances to infuse in and out of the cells as they interact with the environment. And so when I think about certain systems having that capability, it's the same type of thing when we're thinking about public systems. But what we're finding in that some of these public systems is that they can be very closed or more rigid. These systems are sometimes almost impermeable by outside influences. even when they're pushed or challenges. And in social systems, there tends to be, or oftentimes there are policies that are codified into law to protect these systems. And when they're not, what we find is that there are these long-standing practices that are seemingly impossible to change, challenge, or overthrow. And so it's kind of the complexity of working on, broader systems when you can't really identify all of the players and all of the actors and how, what influences that they have on one another. So when I think about this black white comparison, I think of it as a necessary comparison. And from my background, in healthcare, I've come to find out that it's a critical conversation, but one that often gets a little messy with people feeling as if this is a personal attack or this is something that's targeting, saying that people have privilege and they've done something wrong. And so I like to be clear here about why social scientists benchmark racial and ethnic groups against the white population. And also, it's important to note that non-Hispanic whites do not always have the best health outcomes. In many cases, they don't. But what we know is that in the United States, the white population is the current majority population. And so something that I also think is just as important is this notion of social, economic, and political power. And so in the United States, white Americans have the greatest access to social, economic, and political power. This means that there are more white people running Fortune 500 companies, serving as judges in courts, overseeing public institutions. They are also the overwhelming majority in Senate and Congress, houses at the federal level, the state levels as well. So when you're looking at how systems are structured, you would be remiss not to make a comparison to the one group of people who seem to have a disproportionate amount of access to social, economic, and political power. And so, once again, I just want to make it clear that this is not about individual privilege or anything negative towards white people. This is about individuals. I mean, this is not about individuals. It's about the totality of the system. It's about the structure of a society that we live in and how we operationalize a response that has for decades produced different outcomes for different groups of people. For racial and ethnic groups in the United States, there are clear manifestations of differential outcomes. While race may be a social or political construct for those folks who identify as Black or African American, there are cultural characteristics that support their identification as an ethnic grouping. And as such, there's real value to examining health risk and consequences for this particular group. And so now I want to look at a specific example of systemic racism by focusing on the evidence and then working backwards. And so in the United States, Black infants are more than 2 times more likely to die before the age of 1 than white babies. These babies die from birth defects, preterm, low birth weight, from maternal complications, for what we used to call SIDS, we now call sudden unexplained infant death, other unintentional injuries such as suffocation. And so, what we know about Black infant deaths are that there are many different risk factors that place Black babies at a greater risk. These risk factors include individual risk factors, behavioral risk factors of the mother, access to quality and necessary care, provider bias, and cultural humility or lack thereof, and the social environment. However, There is no known combination of risk factors that fully account for the differences we see between Black and white infants. We see these disparate outcomes occurring across education, income, and insurance status levels of the mother, so that a Black college educated mother is more than twice as likely to lose her baby before the age of 1 than a white woman with less than a high school education. So when it comes to the death of women in childbirth, Black women in the United States are more than 3 times as likely to die from maternal complications than white women. And so the same poor outcomes that we saw for Black infants, we also see for Black women. And one of the disheartening things about the Black maternal mortality rate is that this is one of the areas where the gaps between Blacks and white is widening over time. And so it's having the opposite effect of what we're spending billions of dollars trying to resolve. So there are variations in outcomes, you know, for Black women, so that there are some Black women in some particular groups that face additional barriers, additional risk. And so what we see is that it seems as if just being Black within itself seems to be a risk factor for these adverse health outcomes. Yet there is no genetic marker for race. As I previously noted, race is a social construct. So something else must be happening within the system, within the environment to produce these differential outcomes. And so in the United States, we've been spending billions of dollars each year for a couple of decades now to close these gaps, to eliminate these gaps, and it's just not happening. And so there is a need for system level concerns where some of the things that we know is that our most recent research has shown us is that there just seems to be a different level of and standard of treatment and access to care for different groups. Recently, there have been studies that have demonstrated that Black women have different experiences with healthcare providers. So, in particular, studies have shown that Black women often complain that their healthcare providers don't listen to them, that they yell at them, and that they make assumptions about them that are not true. And as we know in the United States, the way that our healthcare system is structured, providers get to pick and choose who they deliver care to based on the type of insurance they have. We also know that there are biased providers who deliver inferior care to Black patients. There are also facilities where the majority of these deaths occur. And one of the most interesting things is that white women do not typically deliver in these facilities. But we can't focus solely on these so-called bad actors, as there are numerous other factors that also contribute to these poor health outcomes. This includes the segregated education system in the United States that has created a pipeline into the prison system for countless Black youth. This includes the criminal justice system that is riddled with so-called bad actors. You see, you don't look at the outcome that George Floyd was murdered on the street, or the countless other Black men who've lost their lives in these interactions with law enforcement. Once you have data showing that there is a disparity in the outcomes for particular groups, at some point you have to look upstream to understand the system that allows the deaths of these Black men, women, and children to proceed unabated. So if there was one, two, or three categories where these disparities existed, maybe we could blame these so-called bad actors. But the fact that Black men, women, and children are at a greater risk of injury, illness, death, and disease, including COVID-19, across all income, education, occupation, and insurance status levels, it's evidence of a broader system at play. And so in the United States, there are some real and meaningful differences between racial and ethnic groups. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for 1 second. So in the United States, there are some real and meaningful differences between racial and ethnic groups that are rooted in history, which still exists to this day. For instance, white people have been able to contribute in a real way to the founding values and principles of this country. And many have been able to navigate, lead, and manage systems and institutions for decades without having to show up and prove that they are or were exceptional enough to be there. And in that same way, that wealth can be passed from generation to generation, so too can disadvantage and deficits. These are not genetically passed along. These are social constructions, ones that we can intentionally dismantle. But first, we have to recognize systemic racism is about understanding established systems that are allowed to create and produce continually these differential outcomes. So my hope for this video is that you're better able to understand the concept of systemic racism and that you're able to see a clear path for a need for public sector personnel to pursue social equity as a critical pillar of public administration. So I leave you with this. Systemic racism is a system of structuring opportunity that disadvantages one group while advantaging another. And understanding systemic racism is critical to social equity because it forces you to look at a system and demand accountability. It is the beginning of a process that looks at a system, be it healthcare, criminal justice, and begins to challenge that system by holding those who uphold it accountable for the outcomes, something that we don't typically do in a society. Naming systemic racism is a political, social, and economic concern because it seeks to disrupt those systems that are allowed to create such vastly different outcomes for so long. It's about those who are in positions of power trying desperately to hold on to that power. This is why those in positions of power vehemently deny systemic racism. So thank you for your time. I hope that I've done a good job in explaining to you what systemic racism is. I look forward to answering this and other questions that may be posed to me in the future. Thank you.